become president of Princeton, then governor of New Jersey, and of course a two-term president. The Congress, in deciding against another marble statue or monument, wanted us to capture both sides of Wilson's life. That is, the thinking, the research, the analysis of policy, coming together with people who actually were on the front lines of making policy. And that's what we try to do. And we have that kind of panel today. And to moderate the panel, we have John Sewell. I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center, clearly. I run a program here on science, technology, America, and the global economy. And that focus on globalization is certainly what brings me to today's panel with a focus on aid for trade. John Sewell. John, raise your hand just so everybody knows who you are. Actually, John is one of those people who needs no introduction in Washington. He is a former Foreign Service officer. For many years, he ran the Overseas Development Council, which was the premier institution focused on U.S. foreign assistance, on the international financial institutions, and the whole role, really, of the United States and U.S. policy in terms of fostering development around the world. John, we are very fortunate, has come to us at the Woodrow Wilson Center as a senior scholar, where he has produced a number of studies and provided a lot of guidance to those of us that like to think we are much his junior. John, let me turn the floor over to you. Thanks, Mike.
Ken, thank you. I am much. No, I'm not much your junior. You're much my junior, and that's. Thanks. Kent Hughes, as he says modestly, runs a very innovative program on trade policy and U.S. competitiveness, which has a great deal to do with third world development, in both senses of the word. And under Kent's auspices, the center managed to spend a considerable amount of time over the past couple of years on issues of aid for trade in the context of the Doha round in particular. And we ended up that project with doing a major conference on aid for trade here, just prior, if I remember correctly, to the Aid for Trade Task Force releasing its report. And I think you can still find the report of that, if I am correct, on Kent's program, that is Stage Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy, on their website, or their part of the Wilson Center website. It was a very good meeting, of which Dominique and Bernard Hoekman and others who are here took part in that meeting. We were very glad, therefore, when Dominic Njuku called us a short time ago and said, would you be willing to host a seminar on the book which his organization, which I'll get to in a second, has just produced in front of you and for sale outside on aid for trade. Or Aid for Trade and Development, as the title has it, which I have had a chance to read a good part of, and it is really the preeminent primer on aid for trade issues looking forward, as Dominique said in the agenda to the book discussion, building on what will happen on aid for trade, given the interest of the WTO, both politically and substantively, and the enthusiasm, if I can put it that way, of the director of the WTO for this particular issue. And where it goes is clear that it's on a separate track from what may or may not happen to the Doha round, a subject on which I wish we assume we will get into in the discussion itself. Let me just say a word about our speakers. We'll run this first session for about an hour, and then switch to the second panel and be followed by a reception. And we hope you'll all join us. Dominic Njuku, whom I have known for some years, is executive director of ILEAP, which, as most of you know, is International Lawyers for Economists Against Poverty, a Toronto-based organization which I think is one of the best of non-governmental organizations working on aid for trade issues and a variety of other issues. Both he and his staff spend more time on airplanes giving seminars than I care to think about. They have produced a whole series of publications, on which this is just one, on the issue of how the developing countries take advantage of trade liberalization, particularly in the context of the Doha round. He was previously worked for the African Economic Research Consortium as deputy director, and he's been the author of numerous articles and on this issue. And most of us know him as the person you turn to for analysis and insight into aid for trade issues. The second member of the panel is Carolyn Robert, who is the senior trade specialist at the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, working on trade and investment. And she's joined there from the IDB office in Europe. She's taken over. And she's worked, as far as I can see, for most of your career on trade issues in general, back to the Uruguay round, of which there are a number of people in the room were also involved, and has been principal advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Trade in Costa Rica. And we're very glad you're here. And finally, Mike Finger, known to many of you, who had a long and very successful career in the World Bank, where he was the lead economist and chief of the Trade Policy Research Group, and was part of the bank's initial coordinator for the integrated framework. He is the article of numerous articles, one of which I think still remains the most quoted and cited article I've ever seen on the cost to the least developed countries of implementing trade agreements. I've never yet seen a discussion of the importance of aid for trade in the least developed countries that doesn't have front and center the article that Mike Finger collaborated on and writing it. So Dominique's going to talk for about 15 minutes because nobody's had a chance to look at this book. But he's going to give you an overview on the substance. We'll inveigle all of you to buy it outside if you wish, because it will be for sale. You'll even autograph it, I assume. And then we'll turn to our two discussants. Dominique, the floor is yours. If you can't hear, by the way, or see, please raise your hand and we'll see what we can do about it, either by using the microphone or not. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks, John, and thanks to everybody for coming. It's really a pleasure for us to have this seminar today. It will be around the book, but maybe let me say I will be very short on the book because the book was written for a particular purpose, and I will want to focus more on that purpose and really to look at where we are and where we are going. So really what I would hope at the end of the seminar is definitely for maybe many people to buy the book, but if we could get a consensus as to how aid for trade can become an important issue in Washington to come and assist developing countries. So again, as the way of background to the book, about 3-4 years ago, we have been working on trade negotiation, and then as all of us know, trade rules are not sufficient. As in early 2005, it was becoming clear that we will have something to do with amending the trade capacity building programs, what is now called Aid for Trade. We had a concern that basically several of the programs have not succeeded sufficiently in Africa, in the Caribbean, that are the countries that we are focusing primarily on, because the contribution of the beneficiaries was not enough in the design and implementation of the program. So the main driver for the book was for us to have a program that would help the beneficiaries shape the design and implementation of the Aid for Trade. And the content of the book really is a series of papers that were commissioned, amongst others, and used to develop a consensus, primarily in the African group in Geneva, with the less developing countries group in Geneva, but also with the African Ministers of Trade and the African Union in terms of and in the Caribbean, in terms of trying to inform the task force Aid for Trade on the perspective and the interests of low-income countries. We were also fortunate that the task force relied significantly on some of the ideas in the book. So again, to be very quick, what are the type of issues that we try to do into the book? In the book is basically, as I was saying, it was a matter of making sure that Aid for Trade is designed in a manner that will respond to the needs and concern of the beneficiaries. So we do have a significant review of lessons from past experience in it, but we were also quite concerned about ensuring that Aid for Trade is properly integrated in the multilateral trading system. What we know now as being knowing that it's a complement to the rules making, but it's not a substitute for it. So that was a concern that we had. In reviewing the past experience, it was clear to us that the private sector has been one of the key players that has not been sufficiently involved in the process, and then we do give a significant attention to that, including in the chapter on the way forward, but also running through the entire book, that we thought that's something that is important. Another issue that we thought is important and which is not properly taken into account is really the cross-border issues and the regional aid for trade. We do have some coverage of that, and trying to build a case as to, although you have the integrated framework that has produced some results, and especially with its current version, enhanced integrated framework, you do have several issues, such as the issues pertaining to the least developed countries, or the regional issues that are not properly taken into account. The final issue that we try to cover into the book is really to see whether it can take a longer-term view, okay, in the sense that it's not just a matter of organizing few workshops, it's really a matter of training, helping create in the beneficiary region a constituency that will properly understand how trade can be an engine for growth. So basically, those are some of the ideas that we have in the book. As I said, we are now more or less, since we did, our first objective was to ensure that we inform the Aid for Trade Task Force. Our next point now is that now that we have a roadmap for 2008, the Aid for Trade Task Force have been approved. What should we be doing to ensure that it's implemented to the benefits of the countries that we are interested in? And that's really the main topic of my presentation. Again, we have been working with various regions in Africa primarily, but we do have some coverage of the Caribbean. So we do have some relationship with Eastern and Southern Africa. And then we work substantially in Central, West, and East Africa. What are the main concerns that, before I get into the specific, with the implementation of the Aid for Trade Task Force, basically many countries and all will be undertaking various regulatory provisions in the negotiations that are ongoing. There is a need to understand the full implication, including how to implement those rules. So that's really an important concern that we have in looking into the implementation. But another concern is to ensure that the Aid for Trade debate is looked at as part of an overall aid discourse. In a sense, we need to bring together the trade specialists and the aid specialists. We need to look at what is happening in the non-OECD countries that are likely to bring some money out to the table. And of course, the final issue is whether we can look at the Aid for Trade as part of overall program on growth and poverty reduction agenda. So what are the type of issues that have come into the programs that we have been associated with in Africa? Primarily, but we did have a workshop in Oxford last week where we did have the perspective of the Caribbean that was presented. So although it's primarily Africa, but it has also been informed by some of the things that is going on in the Caribbean. To implement properly the Aid for Trade Task Force, we need to get commitments coming from both sides. The donors need to come up with the money, and the clients need to come up with bankable projects. In implementing the concern of on the beneficiary side, what is really important for us is to help them come up with the projects and prioritize them, and then come to the donors, and I will come back to the donors at a later stage. In terms of assisting the region, I think we can put the regions into two categories. We have some of them that have the capacity to prepare the projects, and the temptation could be that all of us try to help those, and we have many that cannot design those projects. Again, the temptation could be now that in the rush to get good results, we can forget about that second category and move on. So I really wanted to start by that point, that there are some beneficiaries that can develop those projects. There are many that cannot. So whereby we will be trying to get some of the projects going, we do need to build the capacity of those that cannot. So especially in those that needs a significant capacity building, they receive an issue of institutional capacity rather than looking at the project specific itself. So to go very quickly as the type of issues that are coming up, basically the issues surrounding competitiveness is really some of the catching word that I see coming as the main driver of many of the issues that will be on the table. In the East African Community, COMESA and SADC region, they are focusing on the North-South corridor again. So it's really driven by a trade facilitation agenda, and the concern here is to be able to bring together the infrastructure and the regulatory reform aspect in one. Whereby the trade facilitation agenda is also prevalent in Central and West Africa. In those regions, they do situate the Aid for Trade as an element that will help them implement the regional integration agenda. And in the Caribbean, what came out of the discussion is basically that you need further consensus around an overall trade orientation for the region. I would say that although it came up from the Caribbean discussion, that is not a specific case for the Caribbean. Again, for you to make sure then that there is a consensus around aid for trade or trade for development, you still need some resistance in each region as to how things would evolve. In terms of some of the issues or project-related issues that are coming to the table, trade-related infrastructure comes quite often. We know it's a bit expensive, but then there you do need to consider the hard and soft infrastructure part of the debate. And again, some of that also we had covered in the book. Overcoming the supply constraint is also one of the issues that comes to the table quite often, and especially access to capital and the cost of doing business. Then looking at the problems at the national level, you do need to pay attention to issue of assisting to have emerging strong ownership, leadership that should then underpin the process. Then a third category that will come for the implementation is what I will put into the systemic issues. One of it is basically how do you embed the aid for trade in the multilateral trading system. Again, we started the aid for trade as part of the Doha agenda. How do you ensure that it fits properly with the WTO without undermining the WTO itself? The second element is, which is related, is basically that there is definitely a role for the development banks to play. The Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, a role for the IMF. But again, we need to see how each of those players will come into play without undermining the necessity of having an aid for trade that really helps promote trade and development over the long term. One of the issue that would come into the systemic issue is basically the type of networking that is required. Okay, in term of connecting the private sector, connecting the various ministries involved, and so on. Of course, an important issue is related to monitoring and impact assessment. We do have a process going on at the global level as part of the OECD, but then you do need an equivalent process going on to be going on from the recipient side. Since we'll be coming back to the donor later, but let me point out some of the issues arising from the discussion with the beneficiary that may require some discussion on the end by the donors. One of the first is basically the extent to which the task force recommendation or the reference for the donors in defining their aid for trade strategy. Again, because if we have this good understanding of the donors are defining their aid for trade strategy, what is the reference? Is it the task force recommendation? Because we need the answer to that question such that then when we look at our projects, putting that into the 5 categories of the aid for trade task force, when we come back to discussing with the donors, hopefully we should be talking about the same. One of the key issues that we have encountered that we hope, including from the U.S. side, will take place is basically that we do have people in Geneva who can discuss aid for trade with us. We do have in Washington people who can discuss, but the aid for trade have to be designed in the region. In many cases, the donors have not yet, first, because they have not yet designed the aid for trade strategy, but they have not yet sent instruction to capital to enable people in the region to have the discussion. Of course, one thing that a meeting like this one can help is there something we, coming from Africa or the Caribbean, can do to ensure that first you design aid for trade strategy in the U.S., you give proper instructions to your various missions, such that then our countries can sit down with them and start negotiating on aid for trade. Another issue is that we have also, although we do know that there is weak capacity on our side, there seems to be some weak capacity in many of your mission as well, in the sense that it may, if you really want to make trade an engine of growth and poverty reduction, there may be a case also for you to having proper staffing in your mission on the trade issue, including maybe even here in Washington. Another issue that would be of interest maybe is really, we did have some pledge of funds before the Aid for Trade Task Force was even created. How do those funds fit into the Aid for Trade debate? Are we expecting some new pledges to come up and so on? Again, because in terms of working priorities, we need to know about how much money we are likely to be talking about. Of course, it would be also important to know which region fit as priority for each donor. Because once we have done that, we will then see whether there are some orphans. Okay, if there are some region that are of interest to anybody, what do we do with those regions or countries? And especially that we did start this process as a multilateral initiative. Of course, one of the key also issue that we hope to get from discussion in Washington and other donor capitals is basically whether we can start moving into designing the equivalent of the enhanced integrated framework that would then enable covering non-LDC countries, but there is also the key issue of the regional programs. Again, because the task force left that a bit open, and then we do know that given the small size of African and Caribbean economies, there is significant benefits on going at the regional level. Of course, one other issue is how do we link the aid for trade to to the negotiation. Okay, it's still important to make sure that we clarify that. Of course, here in Washington, it's only maybe for Africa only the WTO negotiation, but in Europe, for example, we do have a concern about the economic partnership agreement. But if I take the same debate here in Washington, it's basically what's the separation between what you have been doing so far and what you will be doing from now. Okay, so basically those are some of the issues that we did consider in the book, but that are coming prominently in implementing the Aid for Trade, and then we are really hoping that we can get into a serious discussion in each of the sub-regions such that by the next Aid for Trade review, we would have come up with very specific projects in each of the regions that would then again help the process moving. I will say that it's really important because in trying to discuss the Aid for Trade, it may be part of ILIP's fault. We did raise some expectation for the overall international community. It will be really useful that by next review we can start having some results that would then keep the momentum going. Thank you.
Dominic, that's a very succinct and full summary, and I appreciate it very much. I'm now going to turn to Carol and Robert, but first, before I do, I forgot to remind people that the meeting is being webcast, which is why the camera is there, and I assume it'll be not only broadcast currently, but it'll be posted on the Wilson Center's website. So you can go find it anytime you want, whether you want to watch yourself or whether you want to use it for training purposes at ILEAP or whatever you wish. Carol.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you very much on behalf of the IDB for inviting us to participate at this conference. Actually, it's a very timely event, as the 2008 roadmap for the Aid for Trade has been just approved in Geneva. And for us as well, very timely, as we are just in the process of finalizing a plan of action to contribute to the implementation of this roadmap. Well, first of all, I would like to mention that the bank has been supporting this initiative very actively since the very beginning, as trade has been and continues to be a strategic area of work for the bank. And in that context, what I would like to do in these 10 minutes is just to give you an overview of what we have been doing in the Aid for Trade, and perhaps more important, what plans do we have for the near future as part of this overall objective to contribute or support the implementation of part of this Aid for Trade. Well, from the institutional point of view, the IDB has made significant efforts to align our institutional structure more recently, technical expertise and financial and non-financial instruments to the trade agenda. And as such, in our efforts to enhance this assistance, we have learned important lessons. What we can say is that perhaps the most important one is that there is overwhelming need for trade-related assistance, at least in the region that is our constituency, the Latin American and the Caribbean, despite the fact that some of the countries are middle-income countries. And you might think that there is no such a need, but there is such a need. And that experience also has given us a keen sense of where the bottlenecks to the provision of the assistance lie and what gaps needs to be filled to make Aid for Trade a truly effective instrument for helping at least these countries. Those needs and gaps emerge very clearly from the first of 3 high-level regional reviews that we organized last year. The Latin American and Caribbean one took place in Lima, and was organized jointly with the WTO and with the support of the government of Peru. And the main objectives of that meeting were mainly 4. The first one was to underline the central importance of trade in development policies. The second one was to identify the main capacity constraints. The third was to highlight the need how to increase and use the effective financing. And the fourth one was to secure political commitment on the way forward on this initiative. The conference lasted a day and a half, and we got like 300 participants from Latin America, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. including ministers of trade and finance, heads of international organizations, senior government officials, and private sector representatives, and of course, key donor agencies. If I should, well, I'm not going to have the time to resume the conclusions of the meeting. We have produced this report with all the proceedings and a detailed description of what the issues were discussed and what the main conclusions were in each of the sessions. But if I can summarize some of them, I would say that basically would recognize that the costs of trade are often higher in the region compared with other developing countries, particularly Asia, because of gaps in physical infrastructure, institutional weakness, inefficient regulatory structures, which are reducing the region capacity to diminish, to compete and diminishing the gains from trade liberalization. Also, I think at the meeting there was a clear emphasis on the need for more and effective financing, including by leveraging development assistance and multilateral lending, both. I was also recognized, though, that trade, investment, and domestic reform are really the main drivers of economic development, but that financial assistance, if it is well and strategically invested, could provide an important catalyst for export growth. I think that as part of the discussions that we got in Lima, great importance were given to 5 particular issues that are main interest for countries in the region. The first one, I think Dominic already mentioned, that is the need to promote country ownership. That was one priority. Then the other one that has been mentioned as well is the importance of acting regionally, which requires the development of regional approaches, including regional financing mechanisms. There was also highlighted the need to focus on priorities, not providing assistance to everything and then focusing really on priorities, and promoting public and private partnerships. The involvement of the private sector in this initiative was highlighted as a key issue. And then, of course, the need for additional financing. There were also working sessions that analyzed in detail specific topics and realities and needs at a regional level, South American countries, Central American, and the Caribbean. And I'm not going to get into that because of the time constraints. But everything, as I say, is in the report. So based on the conclusions that emerged from this Lima meeting, and bearing in mind all the recommendations that emerged from the global meeting in Geneva in November, and in coordination with the WTO, we are putting in place a plan of action for this year, focusing on trying to contribute to the implementation phase of the Aid for Trade. The objective would be to have a focus on country, regional, and sectoral priorities, as it has been highlighted in the roadmap agreed in Geneva. And to that end, we are thinking about coordinating the organization of selected national and sub-regional reviews in Latin America and the Caribbean. The idea is that these reviews would be focused, technical-oriented, and results-oriented, so to really have specific projects coming out of the meetings. And of course, the main objective would be to assist countries in advancing concrete national, subnational, and or regional strategies, very concrete one. We have been coordinating this with countries of the region, with donors and other key stakeholders in the region, and the plan is to have 4 reviews during 2008, a regional meeting in the Caribbean later in the year. Then for the Caribbean, during the Lima meeting, there was consensus that regional initiatives regional approaches is really an issue that needs to be focused on. And they should be seen as a complement to national strategies and should be designed on a case-by-case basis, taking in mind these specific needs of cross-border cooperation. We at the bank has the experience that the Caribbean has a successful experience in receiving regional trade-related assistance. So the idea is to focus on this regional approach in the Caribbean. And at the same time, the Caribbean countries highlighted in Lima the importance of improving donor coordination and focusing on special needs and priorities identified by them already. And of course, the need for scaling up financial assistance for them. The second review would be a sub-regional review, and will take place in Central America in June. Specific dates and venue will be confirmed in the coming days. The idea of this review is that it would have a sectoral focus that would be trade facilitation and technical standards. And basically the logic behind this sectoral focus is that these countries of the region are liberalizing trade significantly by, including by negotiating and implementing very ambitious trade agreements with large industrialized partners. And all this is contributing to their own integration process. But in order to really take advantage of this momentum and of the gains of this improved market access, significant progress is to be made in trade facilitation and technical standards in this particular region, including sanitary and phytosanitary issues. So in the context of the Aid for Trade, the bank, jointly with the Standards and Trade Development Facility of the WTO, is in the process of helping Central American countries to identify where the gap in this area is in terms of assistance and what the priorities are according to the countries. And then the result of this work will be reviewed and presented at this sub-regional review in June. We are also planning to contribute to the organization of 2 national reviews, so country, in the second semester of the year. That would include countries that either already have an Aid for Trade plan, meaning they already have completed a needs assessment and identified priorities, or where priorities have been identified and commitment is there, but they need some assistance to finalize a plan. We are working closely with countries, donors, and other key regional stakeholders to identify these 2 countries in the region. And finally, as part of the plan of action and following the recommendations that emerged from the first global review, the bank is also coordinating with the WTO and countries in the region, including regional organizations, to establish an Aid for Trade support network. And the objective of the network will be basically to assist countries and subregions in mapping out priorities and developing action plans that could be the focus of subsequent national, also national reviews. I think that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before turning to Mike Finger, there are several seats up here and a couple empty chairs you can pull up to the table. We'd be, for those of you in the far back who would like to move up, please feel free to do so. As I warned the early comers, no one will take a collection at the end of this meeting. Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm encouraged to see that the speakers at this conference are on the whole from development institutions, but somewhat surprised that the conference agenda opens with a reference to the World Trade Organization's roadmap for an Aid for Trade initiatives. In my brief comments, I want to look at what's going on from 2 perspectives. The first perspective of what on the ground is happening from the perspective of the capacity of developing country enterprises to engage profitably and constructively in international trade. And to this, I will provide a very positive answer. And the second perspective is what about framework and monitoring? What is this about the WTO's roadmap in this area? And here my response is more questioning than positive. Well, what in fact is happening? Speaker before me mentioned that trade facilitation is one of the more active areas in this. If you look at what's going on in trade facilitation, you'll find that a lot is happening and has already happened if you look at basic indicators of success in trade facilitation, how long it takes to get a container in or out of a country, how many pieces of paper are required to move a container in or out of a country, and how much it costs, in addition to the normal transport costs, to move a container in and out of a country, you will find that by each of these standards, there are a handful of the least developed countries in the top quartile among the 150 or so countries for which these data are available. Most of the least developed countries are in the bottom half. The point I want to emphasize is that 6 to 8 in each of these categories are in the top half, which to me demonstrates, one, that a lot is going on, and two, that the technology that's relevant to making this work is in fact accessible in the poorest countries. So a very positive answer. A lot is going on. What is driving what is going on? What is driving what is going on, at least as I can learn from OECD reports, is a shared interest or shared realization on the part of traders both inside and outside of the country that there's money to be made in having better facilities. The OECD report documents indicates that a lot of own money is being spent to improve these facilities. Even money of the enterprises themselves is being contributed to make these things work. Emphasize, there is indeed a strong ownership on the part of enterprises both within and out of the countries. Relating this to my own experience at the World Bank, I was involved slightly with the project the European Community had started. The World Bank came in on eventually to improve trade among South Central European countries, Macedonia and Bosnia, that part of the world. The political idea behind this was the usual idea that if they traded more, they might fight less. And so it focused in large part on ground transportation within the region and between the region and Western Europe. We found that one of the most constructive contributions to making this work was to help to organize user groups. Many of the users involved here were local enterprises who had contracts with Western European companies for processing. Shirt pieces were cut in Germany, shipped to Macedonia for being sewed and back in. So the Bosnian enterprise had an interest in both things moving in and things moving out quite expeditiously. When these people were organized, to some degree with the help of the European Union, they became an effective political force to not only seek funding but seek political support for what was going on there. So, as to what's going on, there's a very positive picture, both on what's going on, both on the amount of money that's involved, and also on the part of ownership by the enterprises directly involved in this commerce, both inside the developing countries and outside the developing countries. Now, the second perspective, what about more monitoring? Do we need more monitoring? Well, in the sense of more information about what in fact is going on, certainly we need more information. There are a lot of reforms going on. A couple of the speakers before me have mentioned that most bilateral agreements involve to some degree trade facilitation. A friend of mine in Peru runs a consulting company in Lima, has been involved in implementing in Peru the reforms that the Peru-U.S. trade agreement involved. Mexico is involved in 40-some trade agreements with other partners. To what extent do these agreements improve trade facilities? More important than that, to what extent are the improvements implemented as a result of Mexico's agreement with Chile, applied multilaterally rather than bilaterally. It would seem to make sense that if you're going to improve facilities for moving containers in and out, it would make sense to apply the same facility to containers whether they came from Chile or whether they came from Argentina. And so we may be getting a lot of truly multilateral improvement in trade facilities as a result of these trade agreements. So there's much information should be gathered on what in fact is going on and what is propelling these things and what are the disciplines built into the process that we see producing and fostering these reforms. Here I have a caution about monitoring. I was involved in a project that DFID, the UK Development Agency, was involved in trying to tabulate what was going on in trade facilitation around the world. And it was from an OECD report that the DFID had paid for that we learned about the extensive reforms that was going on. Particularly, we learned about the financing, that the financing of these in most cases was local financing. This report was never published. It wasn't a classified report, so no rules were broken by my having been given access to that report or my citing it in work I then did for DFID, but the report was never published. If you look at the OECD reports, you'll find that the OECD reports only on aid in this area, not on locally owned, not on local resources being implied. A second warning about monitoring is the OECD in a recent report has broken down the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness into 28 steps and sub-steps, and then circulated among aid donors and aid receivers a questionnaire asking them if they follow these steps in managing their aid. With regard to that survey, I want to tell two stories, one of which I learned meeting with a bunch of trade facilitation negotiators some time back. The story was told, I think it was told about Kenya, but I'm not sure of the country, that the trade minister in Kenya was hard-pressed by her business constituents to make it easier to move goods in and out of Kenya. She, at her own initiative, found support, put this support together, and implemented, as a result, significant improvements in the trade facilities available to trade in Kenya. I read the Uruguay response, one of the few to the OECD circulation, and when the Uruguay report came to answer the question, do you have a centralized agency through which all aid is distributed, allocated, and subjected to national priorities, the Uruguayans responded rather apologetically, no, what we do is we have an overall budget, and if a minister thinks that he or she can find support from the outside, we encourage them to do it. Whereas the tone of the OECD's questionnaire was to suggest that Uruguay was wrong. Uruguay wasn't doing this right. When from the other perspective, it was acknowledged as entrepreneurship on the part of the Kenyan minister. Conclusion. A lot of what is happening is positive, very positive, positive enough so that it's being driven in many cases by own money, not only country-owned money, but enterprise-specific money. The more we understand about what's going on here, what drives it, the better off we are to push this into a WTO framework in which everything is viewed mercantilistically, or to superimpose a process that presents as a mercantilist issue of bargaining, of assistance in exchange for reforms, would be to introduce conflict into a relationship that's already productively propelled by a perception of mutual benefit.
Good. That was excellent. Now, we'll open it up for questions for a little bit of time till we go to the next panel, or comments, or any way that people want to react. It would be very good if you would identify yourself, and as we seem to be the only ones privileged with microphones, you better speak up and up. Oh, we've got a microphone, never mind. So we'll start this gentleman here.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, for your provocative comments at the end. My name's Ian Gilson from the World Bank. I've just got one comment to make, and this is both to Michael and to Dominique. The first point, Dominique, is I'd like to actually predate the history that you gave at the beginning. I think actually that the Aid for Trade debate started around 2002, 2003, when both ILEAP and also the IMF began to realise that some countries might actually lose from a Doha round. This raises the issue of adjustment and preference erosion. So, firing that back to Michael, surely I agree a lot's being done on infrastructure and trade facilitation, but another part of Aid for Trade is to try and grease the wheels for trade liberalisation by providing, in inverted commas, compensation for adjustment costs or help for the poorest countries to address their supply side constraints. So surely there is a role for Aid for Trade in the WTO. Thank you.
Let's get a couple of questions on the table. Are there others back here? I'm having trouble with the light, but yes, sir, right here in front of me. Sir. Can you pat? Okay, well. Sorry.
Yes, I'm Don Crane with the International Fertilizer Development Center. It seems to me that we're going through a period of structural adjustment and persistent changes in relative prices of food, fuel, fertilizer, and so forth. And so I'm wondering if, from your perspective, first of all, do you see it the same way? And second, are there implications for the trade regime from that?
Good question. Others? You might stand up so we can...
Yes, my name is Pamela Koch-Hamilton. I am the Director of Trade and Tourism at the Organization of American States. Thank you, Dominic. It's good to see you again. I wanted to just find out a little bit more about the Caribbean perspective that was presented in Oxford. Because as far as I know, we don't have one yet. But, you know, I'm sure there was one presented. No, and that's fine. I just wanted to have an idea of what has gone ahead so far. But also in respect to the issues that you raised. The Caribbean, as you know, is one of those middle-income set of countries that is not a favorite of any donor right now because it is considered too rich. And so what you tend to find is, particularly for many countries, they say, well, you know, you're not poor enough. So how do you get out of that, as you called it, donor orphan syndrome? Because everything now tends to be going towards Africa or the LDCs. And then in terms of the framework, how do we move ahead as a region in trying to formulate policies to be able to take advantage of the presumably additional funds? Because it has always been my perception that funds are not really the problem for the Caribbean. Money is not the problem. We have had billions of dollars at our disposal since the Lomé Convention. Somehow, we have never been able to draw down on at least 75% of it, and it goes back every 5 years. So that is it. What are the institutional mechanisms that need to be put in place to change the donor-recipient dynamic, particularly where the Caribbean is concerned? Thanks. And I would like to tell you about a Aid for Trade conference that you're on, that we're planning, but after. Okay.
There you go on an airplane again. Let me turn to you. You got three provocative questions which are quite different. One of which is what's done about those who lose are going to pay costs and not benefit from the Doha round. The second question is really what's the impact of all of these tectonic shifts going on in the trading system, the real trading system, those who are trading in terms of prices and supplies and so on and so forth. And the other is the critical question, it seems to me, of the Caribbean and how they manage to organize themselves to deal with it. then I'll turn to the other panelists too.
Okay, let me maybe start with the last. We are not saying that there is yet a Caribbean or CEMAC a strategy on aid for trade. We are basically saying that we are now trying to have people from various regions be thinking about how to design aid for trade for each of the particular region. What are the issues? How do you go about that? And then our hope is that even after your conference and so on, in the next months or few months, we'll then be able to bring together that reflection from the Caribbean people and the donor community, maybe part of what the Inter-American Development Bank is talking also about, to start coming down with a list of what needs to be done and what is the priorities that would be followed. It's true for the Caribbean and it's true for any region. I think the issue of the aid orphan is an important one. It's true for the Caribbean. It's true for, in fact, for the Caribbean, it's a matter of maybe you are not poor enough. In many places in Africa, it's that you are just too poor. You don't know even so it's a waste of time with you. I don't even want to come there. Okay, so you have those two categories of orphan that are quite important. For the first category, it's basically to say that reaching a certain level is good, but you should push them to become OECD. Okay, but I think the real biggest challenge, which is even maybe a shame for the international community, is that those countries that basically where nothing is can be started, because they cannot they cannot even start recognizing that there is an issue. Even when they do recognize, they have been informed by all sorts of stakeholders about what to do, and many times that is wrong. So you do really need to get into that. So I would maybe just keep pushing the issue and telling people that those two categories of orphans should not be forgotten. Definitely what is going on in terms of relative price change, I do see some trade aspect to it, but we do know that many of the issues around that are not trade related. But definitely it does create more anxiety about trade liberalization. You see what is going on, at least I saw in Haiti, in my own country, in Cameroon, and in many places there has been riots and so on, and it can become a big agenda, and I think it's trade related. We need to take that into account. But again, maybe just to say here that may be one more reason not to let the round fail. Okay, because having it fail, of course, I don't want it to be concluded just for the sake of concluding, but having it concluded properly. But again, maybe that brings home a better case for aid for trade, in the sense that if you don't pay attention to people who lose, they can destroy the entire system. Jan's question, yeah, of course it did start. If you want, in fact, the way we take it, it did start from the beginning of trying to, whenever you thought of making trade an engine of growth, and then you see what happened in the Uruguay round, whereby you did have many implementation issues that were still back on the table, that we were referring to in where Mike did contribute something. So I think it has been there for quite some time. Yeah.
Alan, you want to add to this?
Well, just perhaps a couple of just comments. I think that I mean, it's difficult to get consensus when you add, I mean, when you bear in mind one of these regions like the Caribbean or Central America or even South America, for example, in our case, you talk about a region, but it's very difficult to have a consensus among the regions because actually there are very different countries within the region. I think one of the main conclusions that we heard in Lima from countries was on the need of addressing these regional needs as a complement to national needs and national strategies, and analyzing in a case-by-case basis and not generalizing really on the gaps of or needs of a region. And I would agree also that one of the challenges, I didn't mention that, but it was present in Lima as well, is the capacity of countries to administer really this assistance. The capacity, and we see it every day in our business, is the capacity to disburse the money is difficult in some countries. So even if some countries are really claiming about the need of scaling up assistance, at the same time there is a challenge in terms of disbursing that assistance and that money effectively.
Michael?
We agree on a lot of the yes, some countries will lose from preference erosion. Yes, some countries will lose from European agricultural reform. Put it in past tense, a lot of countries lost a lot from elimination of the MFA quotas, which was a cash cow for development in a lot of countries. And now they not only not get the cash, but they worry about India and China pushing them out of the market. But of course, the biggest shift of funds in the Uruguay Round Agreement was TRIPS, which essentially imposed an obligation of about $60 billion a year for developing countries to pay for stuff which international rules previously allowed them to take for free. For the United States, the benefits of TRIPS is 15 times more than the value of all the market access liberalization. For many of the developing countries, the cost of TRIPS is 5 to 10 times more than the benefits from all of trade liberalization. One thing to win a judgment of that size, it's another thing to collect it. And so you see the U.S. is going around trying to get people to actually pay what the WTO says they owe them. So yes, what's on the table and what's passed at the Uruguay Round did impose some enormous costs on developing countries, and I wish they hadn't. What to do about preference erosions? Should a country not accept not sign on to a multilateral agreement if it sees that the cost of it's going to be larger than the benefits? Commercially speaking, the answer seems obvious. Yes, you don't sign on. Question is then, should the countries who will gain offer bribes certain sums of money? If, okay, you will lose such and such for preference erosion, it comes to $385.64. Here's a check for $385.64. Call it aid for trade, call it whatever you want. Now you sign the agreement, please. That's fine with me. That, market access bargaining, why don't we just turn it into cash? And just admit that that's what we're doing. If you want to give away your benefits you now get from MFA or preference erosion, you ask for cash payments in exchange and call it whatever you want to call it. But it's back to mercantilist bargaining. Certainly I hope no one goes away from this with the impression that I'm against aid for trade. There's a hell of a lot of very positive aid for trade now being provided, and it's being provided in ways that are clearly of mutual benefit to the giver and to the receiver. And I'm all in favor of that and suggest we learn more about it. And if you would like to suggest that we also add to the WTO a facility for paying cash instead of market access concessions, I'm in favor of that too.
Sure. I think it's time to switch to the second set of speakers, and so hold your questions if you've got them, and we'll have time at the end. You'll only have to forego the wine and cheese for a little bit longer if you want to raise questions. So I want to thank the panelists very much. They were very good. They've raised lots of interesting questions, and you'll have the same reaction after the next set of speakers. Uri Nadouche, I do not think is here. Am I correct? but I see Ann Tutwiler back there, and I see Steve Landy in front of me. You can speak from there, although I think we can get you a mic, or you can move over here, whatever you wish.
Over there.
Okay. And Bernard, do you want to sit in for Dadouche, or?
What is he supposed to speak on?
I'm surprised you asked that, Bernard.
This is your opportunity to tell him what he should have spoken on. It's up to you, but I hope you'll, if you don't want to speak, I'll hope you'll weigh in, Bernard.
I want him to speak for Uri. Come on, Uri.
Good to see you. Thank you. Sure. Why don't you sit here? And Steve can sit on my right. Let me introduce the people very quickly. I'm sorry that Uri Dadouche from the World Bank can't be here, but Bernard Hoekman, whom most people know by in person or by his voluminous writings, will be a more than adequate substitute. And because most everybody knows Bernard, I will not give him a long introduction. Most people probably know Ann Tutwiler on my far left, who's Managing Director for Agricultural Markets and for Global Development at the Hewlett Foundation, headquartered here in Washington. She is in charge of the development program and its portfolio of policy research and advocacy spread across the United States, the European Union, South Africa, South America, and Africa. And before that, I knew her, and many of you did, as President and Chief Executive of the International Food and Agriculture Trade Policy Council, which she actually co-founded, which is one of the very creative NGOs in town working on those issues. I bring you regrets from Susan Prowse from DFID in the UK, who fell ill and could not come to this meeting. But I've inveigled my good friend Steve Landy, president of Manchester Associates, who has been involved in these issues for a long time. Is that the way to put it? Who's been working intensively on Aid for Trade, who was in the Trade Representative's office back when I first knew him, who will talk partly from his own perspective and partly from the perspective of Washington. And we've been told each of you should speak about 10 minutes, and Ann, I'll start with you. Excuse me.
Do I need to turn this on, or it's
No, it's on.
Okay.
First on whether you walked in, but you're being webcast. I don't know whether I said that after you walked in.
No, you didn't. I said that after I walked in. First, thank you, John, and thank you, Dominique, for inviting me. I think at one level I know a lot less about Aid for Trade than others of you in the room, so I want to speak to this issue from the perspective, as I had been asked, of a donor. Let me start by narrowing the scope of my job description that John read and say that I'm not in charge of the entire global development program at Hewlett. I'm in charge of the what we're now calling the agricultural markets program in the global development area at the foundation. And I have to also say, in response to the conversation we were having earlier about donor orphans, is that we are largely focusing now on Africa and to a lesser extent on the Indian subcontinent. So to those of you from the middle-income countries, I'm sorry. I know. I'm sorry. Talk to the Gates Foundation. They have more money than we do. So. But let me talk about a couple of things that might be of interest here, and how Aid for Trade has affected our thinking as a donor in this area. When I first started with the foundation about 2.5 years ago, the strategy that I inherited was focused almost exclusively on the WTO, on the trade negotiations at the WTO, focused on reforming U.S. farm policy, and you see how well we have done at that, and focusing on CAP reform, which we are starting to work on now. In the course of doing that work and then subsequently sort of looking to just figure out our longer-term strategic plan, it was certainly something we were well aware of, that you could do all you wanted to in terms of improving the global trading climate, but if you didn't do the work, the hard work on the supply side constraints, if you will, getting stronger prices in the world market, getting better market access wouldn't count for much. So when we came to look more deeply at our strategic plan, when I came on board, we ended up with 4 areas of focus. One of those areas is what we call incentives, which is still around WTO, still around developed country farm policy, but is also going to be focusing on regional integration in Africa and improving regional markets in fertilizer, although I'll come to that, and also in staple foods. The second area that we are, and I'll be happy to elaborate, but I'm just going to be quick. The second area we chose to work in is in the general area of improving farmers and agribusiness access to market information that would help them get better prices and sell their products into markets. And part of that market information is in the area of standards, which was mentioned earlier. The third area, which has a little bit less to do with aid for trade per se, but I think is important in terms of improving the supply side, is in the area of improving regional markets for mainly fertilizer, for farm inputs. And that, again, has to do with market incentives, with the tariff structures, but also with regulatory barriers that are inhibiting trade in those products. And finally, looking at the area of infrastructure. And I want to spend a bit of time on that area of our work, because I think it really brings out a lot of these aid for trade issues. More broadly, and again, I think taking a page from the many articles and work that have been done around the aid for trade discussion, we decided, particularly in my program area, that we weren't focusing on national policies, that we were going to be focusing as much as it was possible at the regional area and at making regional markets work, as opposed to any kind of national development strategies. And going to the issue of ownership, we were are very committed to supporting and taking a cue from African priorities about what to do in each of these areas, as opposed to our own priorities. And so we have done a lot of listening and plan to continue to do a lot of listening to what is being asked rather than what we think is important and what is needed. And I want to respond, maybe just as an aside, to the comment earlier about changing the dynamic between the donor and the recipient in the aid for trade debate. And I remember going to a meeting in the last couple of years where that conversation about donor-recipient kept coming back and coming back. And I just started getting angrier and angrier listening to it, because I thought it said so much about the power relationship that we're talking about, and really kept people in a certain set of relationships just by the language we were using. And it occurred to me that we need to think more about developing countries being the customers of aid. And if you think about it, all the aid agencies wouldn't be in business if it weren't for the developing countries being the customers, the clients. And I think if we start thinking about it in those terms, it changes the power, how we think about the power relationships, about who's in the driver's seat, and hopefully it's the customers. It's not the providers of the product. So let me talk a little bit about the work that we are planning to do in the infrastructure area, or thinking about doing in the infrastructure area, because I think it really brings forward a lot of the issues that have been surfaced in the whole aid for trade debate. As we were trying to understand where a foundation of our size, we're not the World Bank, could be helpful in the arena of infrastructure, we learned of an initiative that has been pushed by the African Development Bank and the new Economic Partnership for African Development around development corridors, which there have been right now about 13 of these development corridors that have been identified where there's a good, strong economic rationale, normally in the form of mining or energy, that can justify and pay for, to some extent, the very much needed infrastructure that will make Africa's natural resource base, including in agriculture, productive. These development corridors were all regional. They were all multi-country. They very much depended on getting the private sector moving in the countries, and depended on public-private partnerships. They were a way to connect farmers to markets, which was something that we felt was very important and part of our strategy. And they were enabled donors to have a concrete focus around, and I don't mean that as a pun, but around a very specific geographic area. And when we started thinking about how this related back to what we wanted to do as a donor in this area, it occurred to us that by focusing around how do you make sure that these development corridors actually bring benefits to the rural communities that are along these corridors, whose interests often get left out when designs are being made about where the roads go and where they don't go, and whether the power reaches rural villages, that a foundation could, or a group of foundations, could come together to support a platform, a process whereby the parties that need to be part of that planning process, that need to be part of the decision-making process, could come together with governments and help decide where infrastructure was placed, what kinds of infrastructure were there, to try to make sure you had these development benefits. And for us, we saw it partially as a way that at least the foundation community could coordinate, because it's our strong belief that people don't coordinate unless they have something real to coordinate around, aside from having meetings, which are all well and good for the hotel industry. But it also could provide an avenue for the demanders or the customers to go to the donor governments and say, we've decided that we need feeder roads to be put in this area, and World Bank, can we ask for some financial support to do that, or African Development Bank, can we ask for support to do that? Or we've decided we need to have rural electrification in this area, because not just because we have people who live there, but because we have 3 agro-processing plants that could work there if we had electricity or clean water. So it provided a way to sort of perhaps turn the tables a little bit about who's making the decisions about what kind of aid comes in. It could also provide an avenue to talk about trade facilitation if you've got roads or railroads that are crossing borders. What specifically do you need on that border to reduce the time it takes to move goods across? So we conceived of this as being a way to sort of bring together a lot of the themes that we talk about when we talk about aid for trade into something that was real. Because I think my frustration, our frustration with a lot of the conversations around aid for trade have been, it sounds great on paper, but how do you really make it work? And so this infrastructure project that I'm describing is our sort of small way of trying to make that aid for trade concept and the Paris Declaration concept a little more real. So.
And thanks very much. It's a very nice parallel to what Mike said about this blossoming of private support for aid for trade, as it were, from sheer self-interest. Very interesting. And in the discussion, if people have examples of other foundations, or it would be interesting to bring them up. Bernard Hoekman.
Okay. Let me just say, I'm not Uri Dush, and I didn't prepare for this, but I'll just quickly take you through some of the kind of key features of what we're doing at the World Bank. Let me start by saying that we've been very much centrally involved in the whole discussion on aid for trade, pretty much from the beginning. And actually, from our perspective, the discussion and the kind of now high profile of this concept in the context of the WTO has been very useful. I'm a trade person, so I believe strongly in trade as an instrument of development, and therefore it really, from my perspective, it really has helped change the dynamics within an institution like the World Bank to focus on this agenda. And I think it's important to kind of say that up front, because there's lots of competing claims, and of course the whole notion of ownership really is one to ensure that we actually are focusing on things that are priorities for countries. But I think it's fair to say that the whole trade agenda had kind of slipped a bit off the table in recent years in an institution like mine. Now, in the last 5 years or so, since the whole kind of focus on aid for trade was put on the table, there's been quite a sea change, I think, in terms of at least the delta, in terms of the change in focus. And there's been an increasing focus on trade-related projects, activities within the institution. If I'd been prepared for this, I could rattle off some numbers. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but there has been a significant increase in the amount, not just of lending, but also in the extent of what we call economic sector work, analysis, focus on trade-related types of activities in country. And I think that's a quite significant increase. There's also been quite a significant increase in the extent of kind of capacity building activities that we do in the area of trade. And the same thing applies to our private sector around the international, the IFC, which is focusing increasingly also on areas relating to export development. Now, a large part of these activities are kind of put together under the umbrella of competitiveness, which is not a term economists tend to like very much, but I think it helps kind of explain what the objective is. The objective is really to try and help improve the ability of both farmers and firms in developing countries to trade. So to allow them to compete not just on the international market, but to also compete with imports. There's an increasing emphasis on agriculture, which is, of course, particularly important given what's been happening recently in terms of food prices globally. And we can come back to the trade implications of that in the discussion. But much of our focus has really been on trade facilitation, logistics, infrastructure-related types of projects. And increasingly, we're also focusing, again, under this broad heading of competitiveness, on the role of services. If you think about what determines the ability of a firm or a particular farm community to compete, it really is driven by costs, and a lot of those costs are going to be services-related costs. Right? So infrastructure kind of deals with transportation, but there's also telecommunications, there's finance, there's insurance, there's a whole slew of services that enter into this. And increasingly, we're kind of thinking about how do we deal with these various services in an efficient way. There's also quite a bit of work ongoing in recognition of the fact that increasingly trade policy is not just set unilaterally, but also in the context of regional settings. Partly that's through formal agreements, regional trade agreements, and we're doing a lot in terms of providing advice, helping in the design of these types of agreements. But most of the work we're doing kind of as an institution is not so much on regional trade agreements, but on regional cooperation. And here I would stress things like power pools, transport corridors. There's a lot of those types of projects that are ongoing in Africa, and they're actually accounting for a significant part, I think, of the lending program in a region like Africa. I'm in the research department of the World Bank, and there I think what I would, just very briefly on that, we've been doing a lot of work, not just in terms of research on what are the links between trade, growth, trade, poverty reduction, which are important, but also just in terms of developing basic data. And I think one of the things that we have been stressing is there's been a lot of talk, to come back to Aid for Trade, in terms of is there additional money, where's the money going? If you read about what the OECD is doing, it's really tracking, delivery of resources. We're really complementing that by focusing on developing indicators on impact, right? So do you actually see an improvement in logistics? Do you see an improvement in the reduction of costs of doing business and doing trade? So an example of that is something called the Logistics Performance Indicator, which we developed last year, and the first report on that has been brought out, which essentially benchmarks countries in terms of their logistics performance. And the idea is to do that periodically so that we can actually track improvement. We have a similar indicator for trade policy, a trade restrictiveness index, which is used in the Global Monitoring Report, which some of you may have seen, which just came out, again, to track policy. And I think these performance indicators are very important, and they're really a key complement to the focus, in a sense, I think, excessive focus, and maybe I can echo some of the comments that were made earlier, on money. I mean, it's not really all about money. It really should be much more about are we actually making an improvement in terms of performance indicators and helping people to actually use the trade opportunities that exist. Finally, we're doing quite a bit of work, of course, with partners. ILEAP is a partner. The integrated framework and now the enhanced integrated framework is something we've been very actively involved in to implement Aid for Trade. And we're also kind of supporting the process in terms of regional prioritization, identification of projects. But I think that's something that is very much being led by the regional development banks. And we as an institution are obviously supporting and supportive of that process, but it's not an area in which we're taking the lead. So let me stop there.
Bernard, thank you. That was excellent, given the fact you had no notice whatsoever. It would have been good even if we'd given you 2 weeks' notice. Steve Landy.
I always say that you can measure the positiveness of a day by how many people you meet that you don't know. And being a pure trade negotiator, there's a hell of a lot of people in this room I don't know. So hopefully we will gain a lot from this and so on. I think I already have gained a lot from this conversation. I think I will, by the way, unlike Bernard, I had a lot of warning, which I think I read the email at 2 a.m. in the morning that I had been selected to substitute for somebody. But since I asked for it, I am very happy to be here and will try to talk in as organized as you can in what I consider a very disorganized topic to discuss and so on. I'm only sorry I didn't have a chance to read this volume before, but I have a feeling I would make a lot more sense than it will make. But having said that, let me approach this issue at least the way we did as trade negotiators. And Michael Finger put his finger on it correctly at the beginning. I remember that I didn't know who Mike Finger was. I was a trade negotiator. And when the Uruguay round was over, I picked up some book that talked about did the developing countries benefit or not from these most recent negotiations. And it was a great book. clear, easy to read, and it was very clear that they may not have gained from the trade negotiations because of the negatives that people tend to forget about and so on when one looks at it. So many of us got together at that stage and had a very simple concept. A concept when John Sewell told me was very simple, and he was correct, but came out of a very simple concept. If you're going to take advantage of market access opportunities that are offered to you, you must make sure that there are funds available to enable you to take care of that particular capacity. Capacity building was the word that came in. It was a very simple idea. It was not meant to be blackmailed, although USTR loved to drop that into the conversation. It was meant to be a very simple economic decision. If you lost preferences, if you opened your markets and so on, there would be challenges created. You would need money for that challenge. The problem in terms of so much aid giving, and again, I'm getting over my head, but nevertheless, hopefully you'll be patient and understanding and so on. It's the problem most aid giving in the U.S. is we have one big budget called aid, help for everybody. So if money goes in to fight malaria, if money goes in to fight AIDS, PEPFAR maybe is out of it and so on, it's all considered part of aid. And usually in that battle, development aid does very badly. It doesn't come out well when you fight the NGOs. So you have that big money. So this was designed, and the key word in terms of the approach of developing countries, and let me again say this is a focus on Africa. I apologize to Pan, but this is where the need is and so on in many ways. And therefore the expression was additionality, a very simple concept. You're going to be opening your markets, so you should have something additional to help. Boy, did that lead to a firestorm, blackmail. Well, what are you adding it to? We have to do some studies, figure out what aid is now so you know what you're going to add to it. Well, that's what aid for trade has become in the WTO, a study. We have the OECD now studying to try to determine what is aid for trade, what is not as aid for trade, so we can have a baseline. What has disappeared from this conversation is not to make the WTO into a development organization. But I should mention that too. That was the other thing that happened. All my development friends and people I didn't even know, I started reading, kept saying the WTO is not equipped to be a development organization. They can barely handle trade negotiations. We didn't want the WTO to be a trade development organization. We wanted it to be a negotiating organization. And what our picture was, and people who were discussing in terms of this group, and I was fortunate enough to be in Hong Kong when people thought we gained something very positive in terms of the Hong Kong ministerial, basically said, no, this is our commitment. If we're going to finish the trade negotiations, you need the developing countries, you need the African countries to sign up at the end of the day. They found out what happened in Cancun when the developing countries were not on board. We found out what happened in Seattle, minus the demonstrators, when the developing countries were on board. So there was some pressure there. The thing that also happened, and we didn't expect, the kind of blindsided, was that the African countries did not want to condition aid for trade in terms of negotiation, because they were nervous that if they said that, immediately people would try to get trade concessions from them. So there was no great desire either in the African countries to make part of this deal or not. One day I'll discuss some of my discussions with UNCTAD people, but that's a different discussion. We'll do that later on. And some of my good friends at Oxfam. But that decision was made too. They didn't want to play the game. Okay, fine. All of a sudden there's something new that shows up about a year ago. The absolute worst trade development instrument I have ever seen. And it's something that's called EPA. Not EBA, everything but arms, but EPA. Now again, time's short, so I'm not going to go too much through this. But this is the worst of everything. Because all of a sudden, after telling the developing countries, and the developing countries, I'm saying, I don't want to be trading off market access yet for aid, but I'm not sure the aid's going to flow, and then I'll make a permanent commitment on market access. EPA shows up, and using some rule that no trade person even know existed in the WTO, that you can't provide special treatment for Kenya and the Cameroons because they're such industrial, mighty countries, but you can't provide it for Tanzania and Uganda because they fall into a UN definition that's tied to nothing to do with export capacity or competitiveness. Because of that fact, all of a sudden, the basis of European Union trade program towards African countries, the trade provisions of the Cotonou Agreement, were no longer useful. So all of a sudden the Europeans show up. God, they do have more nerve, but I do admire European negotiators. They show up and they all of a sudden say, okay, we want a full economic partnership agreement. We know we agreed in Singapore not to talk about investment, not to talk about government procurement and so on, but we want that in this agreement. And by the way, we want you to open up 50% of your services. This is after the same European Union under Mr. Lamy had told the least developed countries, say, by the way, you don't have to give us any concessions at all, which I think was also a mistake and so on. And when it comes to your goods, we only want you to open up 80% of your market. And the extent for which we really know that you're entitled to more aid for this. After all, you're going to have money. You're going to lose tariff revenue. You're going to have adjustments. I don't know what the new market access opportunities are, but you're going to have market access. You need to have all that stuff in there. Oh, but we can't talk about specific money. No. Maybe we'll give you $300 million for a Caribbean fund. No. We've already done that. We've already given that in the G8 when they made these big commitments. So none of that's ever in there with any specifics. And that's what they did. But what they did is they used trade negotiating leverage. And they basically said, Kenya, you want to sell flowers, Ghana, you want to sell groundnuts. Well, all those preferences will disappear. So basically, what has occurred in this aid for trade exercise, which was a very simple concept. Mr. Finger wrote a book, pointed out that developing countries did not gain that much. We call poorer countries did not gain that much, but they don't quite have a capacity to produce. You ended up with that, ending up with absolutely nothing. Where are we today? Well, there's a marathon going on in Geneva. Can we finish this round in time or not? Before the mean Democrats come in and do something to the trading system that no one expects, It's the worst thing. So all of a sudden Brazil, and the only person that's saving us from a quick ending of this negotiation could be the Indians, because I don't know whether they're going to go along with this or not. But everybody else is chomping at the bit. We have our development issues. All of that, I don't hear that. Doha development round has become the Doha agricultural round, which is also poorly timed, because what is the problem we're now facing in agriculture? Thank you. What are the problems we're now facing in agriculture? We're now facing the problems of prices being too high. That's why we had the Doha round to begin with, is to raise prices. Maybe somebody should take a step back and say, maybe we should double the subsidies, at least until we get over these food shortages and so on. Meantime, we have Africa divided because of this silly definition between least developed countries and not. Some have joined, some have not joined, these EPAs. What is that doing to regional economic communities? I don't quite know yet along the way, and so on. And are we living up to the G8? Are we living up to the G8 obligations that were taking, 50% of ODAs are supposed to go to Africa, and there were some funds included? I can't answer that. I'll take you. But I don't see a great thing. And the U.S. runs its own program, and that's how I was just going to conclude with this. What do we have in our program? We have a U.S. Agency of International Development that did learn something about development, but losing more and more money for trade-related program. We have MCC that came up with 19 conditions or 18 conditions. They don't know NEPAD exists, which at least has the donors involved. They may not be reappropriated. It seems very questionable what the future is, since they seem to have run out of money and so on. So I would say, and the message I would deliver is that I'm really happy we did this book. I'm happy we've had conversations early about for aid for trade, but I view it as an absolute positively failure, and I'm sorry that I was one of the people who worked with many other people to put this on the WTO agenda, because I think we got a big goose egg. Thank you very much.
Nice non-controversial U.S.-centric approach. Now, you've all been patient. The floor is open for any and all questions. And I have a question. To both speakers and others. So, questions? Oh,
I think he said he had a question.
You got a question?
I have a question. I have a couple of questions.
You have two.
Will I ask every speaker?
Go ahead.
Who is this?
Oh, yeah, you have to give us your name. And
Sure, I'll do. No problem. Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. First to end, if you say the national policy is going to change to the regional policy, that means bilateral agreement will go into the mutual agreement. And Bush administration is going all the way for the bilateral. And if administration change, will be changed if a Democrat or Republican be the president? And also, what do you mean that regional barrier? And to this gentleman, we don't have a name here. You talk about some indicator, and I think you mean indicator or impact, right? And what are they? Third, for this gentleman here, Stephen. Does trade we have now is a free trade? Thank you.
Maybe a couple other questions on the table for in the far back there, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Carlos Echeverria from the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture. Steve, knowing you from about, 20 years, I knew you were going to be exciting. Come with something like that. Very, very interesting.
Say 30 years, young man, 30.
I prefer 20. Anyway, thank you very much for the invitation and for an excellent seminar. This is very interesting, very important, I think. Now, I am a bit confused, frankly, about what's aid for trade, what is the meaning of it, what is the meaning, for example, for my constituency, which is, coming from an IGO, intergovernmental organization, from the hemisphere, from all the way from Canada to Argentina. What's aid for trade? Is it a strategy? Are new funds coming, or we are just using the same funds? How was it developed? Was there a consultation process, or is there going to be a consultation process? Is there a role for entities as ours that specialize, IGOs, that specialize in the agricultural sector, that work closely with the ministers and work closely with the farmers and other sector societies? So far in the last years, we have been involved in many initiatives. So I don't see the difference ahead. What is going to happen? Because, we have been active. We have been active with the banks, advising, helping the countries, making us part of the processes. But what is it going to be different from now on? Thank you.
Good questions. Other questions? I'm looking. I've got the light in my eyes, and so if I don't see you, stand up. If not at the moment, let's turn it back to the panel. And you can tell us who's going to be the next president of the United States. But I think the question really is, what about, will there be changes?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, I think perhaps I wasn't clear in my remarks. What I was trying to say is that our focus is on regional integration within Africa, not regional trade deals. So helping facilitate trade among African countries, not trade deals with the United States or with European Union. So
but you talk of then that would be several countries together.
Well, there are regional groupings within Africa who are working, like COMESA and like ECOWAS, who are working on identifying those barriers in particular markets and figuring out what needs to be reduced in terms of tariffs, or in the case of fertilizer, how to standardize, or make the standards for fertilizer uniform so fertilizer can be traded across between Kenya and Uganda, for example. So that's what I'm talking about, not whether the U.S. is going to be negotiating bilateral deals with certain countries. And I have no idea what's going to happen in the election or what trade strategy that the government might pursue.
Just in the agricultural sector.
Our focus is on agriculture, yeah, yeah. So, and I think I answered the question about regional barriers, that we're talking about tariffs, but we're also talking about non-tariff barriers to trade within African countries. In terms of the question from Iika, which if I can just make a comment from my perspective, and maybe to Stephen's comment about getting a big goose egg on aid for trade, I think if you narrowly think about it in terms of the negotiations, that goose egg may be a close approximation. I do think, though, that the conversation that was started has changed the way a lot of us think about what we're doing in terms of foreign aid, and I think it's changed what countries are thinking about doing in terms of their own national policies. And for me, one of the important conversations, and I don't mean to sound harsh about this, but we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years a vast increase in the amount of spending in the social sector, in terms of healthcare particularly, but also education. And that's great. I mean, there's certainly needs. But what we have seen on the other side is a real decrease in the amount of funding that is meant to build long-term economic growth. And I think that the aid for trade conversation has helped the development community get back to thinking about that side of the agenda. And you certainly have the questions about, is there additional money, et cetera. But I think that at least people are now beginning to understand you can't just focus on the social side of the ledger without making sure that in the longer term you have economic growth to back that up. And I can't resist. I've got to come back on should we double the subsidies to deal with the higher food. I know in a way you meant it as a joke, but I can't. I'm sorry, I can't resist. First of all, I'm not sure doubling the subsidies in the U.S. and Europe would do anything to address the food shortages because of the food crisis right now. I think what this is a sign is that we need to really invest in improving productivity in developing countries where that makes sense, and to maintain an open trading system so that countries know that if they can't produce food that they can buy it, and very concerned about the export bans and restrictions that had been put in place in that regard. The other thing to say about the subsidies, though, is for those of you who aren't agriculturalists, you might do well to remember that the U.S. Farm Bill was a temporary policy that was put in place in the 1930s. So my worry is if we decide to double the subsidies, we will have them 60 years from now when we are in a very different economic situation. And just on the other side, part of the reason, not the whole reason, but part of the reason we have these high prices right now is due to other sorts of subsidies in the biofuels area and mandates in the biofuels area. I understand IMF said on today's paper that they believe that 50% of the current price run-up is due to biofuels. I know Joachim von Braun has said 25%. Whichever it is, that's huge. And it's a piece of the run-up in prices that we can actually do something about, as opposed to the weather in the short term. And the demand side that's driving this is something we should all want to see. So I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
Well, that's good. Bernard?
On the indicators, what I was trying to focus on is essentially these are indicators of performance. Right, so what's actually happening at the country level in terms of logistics, in terms of trade policy, what have you. It's not impact evaluation per se. I mean, the World Bank does a lot of impact evaluation, and certainly some of those projects are going to be trade related, but I was talking more about general indicators of performance across countries so that we can actually track what's happening in terms of both trade performance. Yeah. Anne has pretty much said what I was going to say in terms of what's new in terms of aid for trade. And I think there's really nothing new here in terms of the substance, but there is, I think it is essentially giving the people who care about trade as an instrument for growth, a voice, right? And I think that voice had kind of been attenuated a bit over time. So I think that really is one of the key issues. I think the other dimension of what is new is an explicit recognition that trade agreements don't come without costs, right? So there will be adjustment costs associated with trade agreements, and that's not something that anybody didn't know, but I think it's now explicitly recognized as an issue in the WTO, but also in trade agreements more generally. And it goes back to the point of the type of work that Mike Finger did in the late 1990s to document that, actually assessing what those costs are is important. I also can't resist one more word on agriculture, and I think one of the things that is happening with respect to this issue of should we be doubling subsidies, again, Anne has answered that, but I think what is happening now in terms of the reaction by everybody who is a net exporter of anything to restrain exports is really bad news from the perspective of a multilateral system, where if you believe as an economist that we should be producing and trading according to our comparative advantage, if net importers cannot have access reliably to a world market for the types of foodstuffs and commodities that they need to feed their populace, then where we're going to end up is a situation where everybody is replicating the cap. And then we're not just going to be doubling subsidies, we're going to be quadrupling. Subsidies are going to go up tenfold, if not 20-fold, and before you know it, that's the end of a trading system that has been, painfully built up since the Second World War. So I think this is very much, from a systemic point of view, what is happening is really worrisome. And as far as I can tell, you only read about this in the Financial Times, which, is also worrisome.
New York Times. New York Times.
Okay, New York Times as well.
A lot of people read the Financial Times, thank goodness. The question was raised, this is to really you and
Can I respond?
Dominique. Yeah, just a minute.
I think we're done.
One of the questions asked by the gentleman there is he said the IGOs, the International Intergovernmental Organizations, involvement. My sense is that in Geneva, the involvement of quasi non-governmental organizations been pretty in these debates have been pretty high in the aid for trade discussions. That my sense is that there's been a lot of NGO input. Is that a fair statement, or?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, Dominique can speak to this. I mean, Dominique has been heavily involved in all of this, but certainly institutions like the International Center for Sustainable Development, that's just one I know that has been quite actively engaged. Do you want to speak to this?
I think the role of the IGO, the way he presented, is something that will be very useful. Is something that will be very useful in 2008, because basically what we need is to build a constituency around very specific set of projects that would be put to the table and try to be put as a priority. So I would really say this is really the time for you to get in, because last year it was more or less like try to lobby for the rules to be made, to the initiative to be started. But now that we are moving to identifying projects, making priorities and so on, I think this is the best time for you to get into the process.
That's good. Let me turn to Steve, and then I've got at least one more hand and probably a couple of others. But don't forget, this is a discussion about aid for trade, not agricultural subsidies.
I won't crack a joke again about subsidies. I will say this much, that as with fish, if things go on too long, they begin to smell. We now have come to the idea that trade negotiations are supposed to last for many years. We saw what happened with Uruguay. And by the time you end it, you forget that maybe your objectives should change. And that was the message I was trying to deliver. That we may have to focus on how do we increase production and other matters and so on, etc. And I also don't think it's fair to blame subsidies because oil prices are $110, and that may be perhaps more. Let me respond, however. First of all, negotiations should be about freer trade. It's not about free trade, but hopefully when you come to an end of a round and you look at all the deals you made, you could say, I have freer trade. Sometimes you don't have freer trade with some of the tariff rate quotas you end up with, but you try to have freer trade. That's my response. As to Carlos.
Yeah, that's the name I want to know.
But let Steve finish it.
Okay. I think we'll have freer trade. As to Carlos's point, despite the fact he's a Boston Red Sox fan, and so he does make good points, there is one successful aid for trade program that's being carried out, and that's by China. People are very upset with China. They don't go through all these conditions. They're not really part of the team. They basically have said trade means moving goods. There are minerals, raw materials there. We'd like to take them out. They build a road. Then everybody gets mad at the Chinese because they're not processing. They say, I'll tell you what, we'll do something better. We'll send our people into your countries and we'll help process the stuff. So no one really has taken a step back and done a serious discussion. It's so easy to react to Chinese, quote, mercantilist thing. I'm not necessarily in favor of it, but it would strike me that from what Ms. Roberts said, and so on, and from what Dominique just said, is yes,